Aloha. It is my great honor to welcome you to this inaugural Soifer lecture. What a wonderful occasion to celebrate a wonderful movie. Now, before we get started, it's my great pleasure to thank and welcome Mr. Reed Hundt. Thank you so much. Thank you both for your incredible generosity in allowing for this possibility at this law school. We are forever grateful. Just a little bit about Reed. Reed, most importantly perhaps, was a classmate of newly minted Professor Emeritus on the school. And is a great friend of Avi's, which means he's a great friend of this school. They went to Yale College and Yale Law School together. Reed is the president of the Hundt Family Foundation. He is the co-founder, the CEO, and the former chairman of Coalition for Green Capital, a nonprofit that directly supports investment in clean power platforms. Previously, Reed founded and led Making Every Vote Count, a nonprofit seeking national election reform, and served on numerous private and nonprofit boards of directors. I am remiss in saying who I am. It suddenly dawned on me through my Dayquil and NyQuil haze that I was remiss in saying I'm Camille Nelson, and I have the incredible privilege, really, of serving as the dean of this law school, following in the incredible footsteps of Dean Soifer. So thank you so much for being here. I will continue with my brief remarks about Reed. If I were reading his full bio, we would all be here until it was nightfall. So please forgive me, Reed, for summarizing as best I can. Right. So Reed served as chair of the Federal Communications Commission from 1993 through 1999. Previously, he practiced with the international law firm of Latham and Watkins. He also taught at Yale Law School and at the Yale School of Management. Additionally, as a faculty member here, I'm particularly jealous of the fact that Reed authored numerous articles and 5 books. So be sure, that's a teaser, be sure to look up those books. They include A Crisis Wasted, Barack Obama's Defining Decisions, 0 Hour, Time to Rebuild the Clean Power Platform, The Politics of Abundance, How Technology Can Fix the Budget, Revive the American Dream, and Establish Obama's Legacy, which he co-wrote, In China's Shadow, The Crisis of American Entrepreneurship, and You Say You Want a Revolution. You can hear the music in my head. A Story of Information Age Politics. So he is a man of many talents and clearly a Renaissance man. And we are truly fortunate that he has chosen to invest in this law school in the way that he has and to uplift a great human being who has meant so much to us at this law school and indeed this university. Obviously, this entire community. And thank you so much for being with us on your Friday evening. I think you're in for a real treat. And with that, sir,
thank you.
I yield to you.
Thank you very much, Dean. This is actually my second visit. I was here only 19 years ago. Things look really great. So I thought that I would give you the short and the long of why this lecture series exists. Here's the short of it. Avi and I and a few other people of a similar age about a year ago started chatting on this thing called the internet about what we regarded as the somewhat whimsical decisions the Supreme Court was making. And we formed the idea that it might be good to get, if we could lure them, distinguished professors to speak on this topic. And the first effort that we made was with Dean Cherminsky at Berkeley, which was a success. And that lecture will be a month from today. And then the group of us, when Avi was not in the connection, said, okay, well, we already have the answer to where the other lecture should be held. We'll just, of course, Avi to suffer the embarrassment of having it be called the Avi Soifer Lecture and having it be here. So that's the short of it. And here's the long of it. So as the historian Maitland said, what is now in the past was once in the future. So I'm going to take you back briefly, but for a quick trip to 1968. Avi and I are already friends. We are friends as aspiring journalists at the oldest college daily, the Yale Daily News. And Avi has the bright idea that he is going to change what then was 267 years of history. 267 years of Yale College never admitting women. And Avi had the idea that he would change this. Now, this is 5 years before Roe v. Wade, 6 years before women could get a credit card. A single woman could get a credit card. What is now in the past was once in the future, right? And so what Avi decided to do was to bring a student movement into being that would force Yale to make a decision, which at that time had already been debated for 13 years. Debate, namely whether to go co-educational, debated on a faculty of 800 that included 2 women only as tenured professors. So it wasn't the case that the faculty, and certainly not the alums, were going to ask for change. So Avi decided to make the story really, really short, to invite 750 women to come and live at Yale for a week. I didn't know that he knew 750. Person that I knew that he knew who was female was Marlene, and he only knew her because he met her in Hebrew school when they were 11 years old. But somehow he managed to get 700. This is all a true story. He got 749 others to show up, and then only about a week later, the president of Yale said, "I give up. We are going to admit women." And then they had a very famous meeting that Avi also arranged, where the president presented his idea the women would be admitted in the future at an uncertain time, and they would live far enough away that nobody could get in trouble. And then there was a confrontation, and Avi prevailed, and they were admitted effectively immediately. Not fast enough for us because we graduated the next June, but they were admitted the next September. That very next year was the first time that any woman was tenured on the faculty of a law school in the Ivy Leagues. That was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it was only in 2016 that Yale Law School finally had a woman dean. And it was only last year that Yale College Yale University finally had a woman president. So the story I'm trying to say is what is really important when you're 20 years old. And there are 2 things that are really important in my view, if you'll let me look back. The first is that's when you choose your values and your beliefs. And the way you do that is you read and you study and you go to some classes, but mostly you look at the people around you. And you look at what they're doing and you look at what they're saying and you decide, that's somebody I want to be like. And the second thing that happens if you're really lucky when you're 20, you make a lifelong friend. And that's Avi. Thank you, Avi.
Very.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Reed, for not telling all the stories. I was really worried when I heard that he wanted to go first. We are almost the same age. He's only a few days before me, and I've been trying to catch up ever since. But we were and are good friends, and we have chosen very well those we hang out with, Betsy and Marlene. And so the kind of thing that Reed just talked about, of course, is essential in the friends you make who are really close to you, the partners you choose in whatever way you want. There are a lot of words that we're not supposed to say anymore, I've just learned. And you've all seen probably some of those words. It's an astonishing list of the words that have to be omitted. You're not supposed to say systemic, for example. You're not supposed to say discrimination. You're not supposed to say equity, of course. Who would ever want to think about equity? And you're also, in a way, pressed to visit the issue of who's included and who's outside. And one of the things in that story is that you can say silly things and get away with it. I was the quote of the week in the New York Times saying, women are people too, huh? But we got a lot of publicity. We did have to push and pull somewhat. King Brewster was open remarkably to co-education, to having public school majority students. I was one of those in the first class that had public school. You let them in and look what happens. But it was, of course, without changes needing to be made. So this was in November to admit a class for the following late summer, right? It's amazing. And these days, everyone would have more sense than that. But King Brewster co-opted me, put me on the co-ed planning committee, and we made a lot of mistakes, but we also got a lot done. So it was a different time. It was a time where we made a lot of mistakes, but we also had some dreams. And I think we still have those. It's a very tough time, I think we are in, and it's kind of hard to know how to respond. And one of the joys of my life, great honor for me, is to have been a teacher. Because being a teacher brings new ideas and brings some hope, I gotta say. And I have a lot of hope knowing the current students. They are in many ways disgruntled and disappointed, and they face a very tough uphill battle on a lot of things. And our generation didn't do so well in terms of some of our ideals. So that helps make it difficult for them. But they're willing and they're able and they're aware of some of the great crises that are facing us. And it is a wonderful thing that Reed and Betsy have done to give us a chance to invite people to speak to the constitutional dilemmas for modern times and maybe even to the future. Thank you so much. And thank you all of you who came and those who worked on this. So we're going to have quite a party, I'm told. So stick around, and I'm not going to talk long because there's a big party awaiting us. You've all read about Ellen, I hope, and she really is the expert, and she's recognized as such on where we're going with the new technology, with information, where we ought to be going. So she set up, co-founded a center that does this. She's always in demand, it seems, in the world of speakers and commentators on these matters. She's still, as you can tell, very young, and you have probably seen her biography. But the words are still in there. She worked at Covington and Burling, if I'm allowed to say that. So she worked as a very good lawyer in a very good law firm, but she has been a star teacher for a long time and does everything. And I have good sources at Rutgers, and she really does do everything. So it's my pleasure not to take any more of your time, but it's Ellen Good. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Oops. Back. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I really want to thank the Hundt family for inviting me. I'm so thrilled to be part of this celebration for Avi. I want to thank Dean Nelson, who we tried to recruit to Rutgers, and so I'm jealous that you all her. So where to begin? And I also want to say that it's just such a pleasure to be in this gorgeous, special state. I've had such a great time so far, and I just the words, just the musicality, the gentleness, the interesting fabric of culture here is just extraordinary. Okay, let's see if this is working now. Okay, so my topic is tyranny.gov. Technologies of Unreason. I was invited to consider for this lecture Lincoln's 1938 Lyceum address entitled The Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. Everyone will understand the relevance of his great speech that lambasts tyranny, warns of mobs, preaches reverence for rule of law, and worries about the fragility of the American Republic. For nearly a decade, lovers of democracy have been anxiously citing Tim Snyder's On Tyranny and checking off the steps on the slide down. Authoritarian slippage has come to seem more like a lurch, as President Trump and his commissars explode all constraints on executive power, issue unconstitutional orders, and pardon January 6 militants, sending the message that violence in service of the leader is acceptable, if not welcome. I could spend our time here together lighting every strand of hair on fire, cataloging the demolition of law and the corruption of our political institutions. But you know it already. Mindful of Avi's great love of history and his work on constitutional meaning in service of liberty and equality, I do want to ground this talk, not for too long, but for a little bit in the moment and meaning of Lincoln's address to his Jacksonian audience. It was a time of roiling violence and lawlessness in American life, when it was not clear, least of all to Lincoln, whether the wildly ambitious and deeply compromised vision of the founders would be buried with them. Today, as we approach not only the 50th anniversary of this institution, but the nation's 250th birthday next year, we are mindful of how Benjamin Franklin replied when asked in Old City, Philadelphia, about the form of government the founders had just created. A republic, if you can keep it. By the way, these are pictures from my walk home. Has his skepticism been vindicated? The republic is founded on rule of law, with legal constraint binding up a diverse and energetic populace. The insurrectionist in the Oval has moved with shock and awe to undo legal constraint. The flex of strength in the face of the law is the point. Legal constraints, even where they remain, simply cannot scale when a culture of impunity takes hold. Culture is the subject of this talk, and particularly the transmission of culture through communications. The grip of law and political institutions, the exercise of small r republicanism, is dependent on a supportive culture, something that Lincoln centers in his Lyceum address. He alludes to the fact that reverence for the law is a demand-side proposition. The people have to want it. Virtue signaling in our public sphere can be obnoxious, but at least it bespeaks a cultural appreciation for virtue. By contrast, vice signaling, of the kind we saw this week in the joint session of Congress, celebrates a disdain for virtue. Maybe that virtue is a sucker's game. Communications technologies, I suggest, are central to what signals are amplified. Trump has mastered each medium of communication, starting with the tabloids through reality television, talk radio, and social media. It's possible that each medium has made it harder for our political institutions to function. The rule of law exists, to use Henry Steele Commager's term, in an empire of reason. Reason, with a capital R, is the centerpiece of Lincoln's address. It is friend to science, antithetical to arbitrary power and chaos, mother of ordered liberty. Each communications technology promises to enlarge empire's reason, but each has delivered only fitfully. Today's media assaults us with what journalist Janice Rose has called impenetrable nonsense, designed to get us, quote, to coast and seethe and doom scroll into the void, to overwhelm and paralyze, Rose says. I will start my talk with a look at Lincoln's Lyceum address and what it says about law, reason, and the mob. The heart of the talk, part 2, is an argument that the communications technologies Trump has mastered have increasingly worked to subordinate reason to passion, constructive compromise to performative obstruction, and ordered liberty to mobocracy, and that is Lincoln's term. I will add to that my word, trollocracy. In January of 1838, a 28-year-old Abraham Lincoln took the stage at the Young Man's Lyceum in Springfield, Illinois. He was a relative newcomer to that city in the early days of Van Buren's presidency, which continued Andrew Jackson's populist reign. In the eyes of Lincoln and his fellow Whigs, Andrew Jackson had desecrated the office. He was personally violent, a duelist who had engaged in gunfights and defied the Supreme Court in an extermination campaign against Native Americans. Every day there were street fights animated by ethnic hatreds, and plenty of days there were lynchings to put down the stirrings of African American liberation. It said the 1830s were the most violent time in American history outside of war. So Lincoln rose to deliver his lecture only a year after the last of the founding fathers had passed away with the death of James Madison. And he begins with the paean to the founders, who he said had bequeathed a legacy of quote unquote blessings and a political edifice of liberty and equal rights. So how would this generation, fallen as it was, sustain those blessings? From the start, he was engaging with Franklin's question, asking with evident fear how this now orphaned nation would perpetuate the American experiment in self-government. The fear was about, quote, something of ill omen amongst us, by which Lincoln meant, quote, the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of courts, and the worse than savage mobs for the executive ministers of justice. On the minds of the Springfield audience would have been the recent murder in Illinois of Minister Elijah Lovejoy, a prominent abolitionist, the first lynching of this kind in the North. The mob had taken it upon themselves, as Lincoln put it, to, quote, shoot editors and, quote, throw printing presses into rivers. The leaders of that mob had just been acquitted, and I'm not joking about this, by a judge named Lawless. Historians believe Lincoln's audience would have had contempt for Lovejoy and approved with that judgment. So Lincoln elevates two other episodes to make his point about the dangers of a mobocracy. There had been a lynching in St. Louis of a mixed-race man named McIntosh. McIntosh had killed a cop and was awaiting what would probably have been a death sentence. A mob that could not wait for official sanction dragged him out of custody and set him on fire. The other episode concerned murders in Mississippi of gamblers. Describing this mob violence, Lincoln observed the strange fruit of the dead, quote, literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside and in numbers almost sufficient to rival the native Spanish moss of the country. In telling these stories, Lincoln positions the mob and governmental or legal authority as distinct and contrary forces. Today, corruption of legal authority is happening in collaboration with the mob. A mobocracy need not take the form of people with pitchforks or bear spray. It can be online anons doxing the vulnerable or oppositional, or swarms of bots harassing people, even government officials, into silence. Rewards for intemperance plus virality can bring the physical mob to any place at any time. Think how bar fights and street spats are now content to be captured and monetized, and sometimes used to mobilize. When these technologies of conquest, cum performance, enter into government, when they influence or become governing tools, the mob merges with legitimate authority. There is then no clear line between a mobocracy and our political institutions. In his address, Lincoln has three things to say about a mobocracy. First, it metastasizes. Quote, the lawless in spirit are encouraged to become lawless in practice, and having been used to no restraint but dread of punishment, they thus become absolutely unrestrained. Having ever regarded government as their deadliest bane, they make a jubilee of the suspension of its operations and pray for nothing so much as its total annihilation. Elon Musk's Doge is dismantling agencies with gleeful abandon. Musk is a man and not a mob, but he performs Doge's every move for his 200 million X followers, using mobocratic tools of inflammatory lies. The historian Quinn Slobodian identifies the anti-government sentiment in this administration as having three sources. There's the traditional anti-New Deal ideology. There's the private equity smash and grab technique. And then there's what he calls, quote, the extremely online world of anarcho-capitalism and right-wing accelerationism. Musk is an exemplar of this last category. The goal is not smaller government. It's the annihilation of government as we know it, yielding to governance by AI and those who control it. Second thing we learned from Lincoln, the mob comes for you. It is uncontainable. Once it is loose, arbitrary power reaches for everyone. Lincoln says, quote, the innocent, those who have ever set their faces against violations of law in every shape, alike with the guilty, fall victims to the ravages of mob law, and thus it goes on step by step till all the walls erected for the defense of the persons and property of individuals are trodden down and disregarded. The American Bar Association has tacitly recognized the mob's omnivorousness in its unusual letter standing up for rule of law. Whatever your views on particular policies, it wrote, quote, no one wants their neighbor or family to be treated this way, meaning subject to arbitrary exercises of power. Trump voters who have been summarily fired by DOJ have found out the hard way that walls breached fall on them too. Third, the mob abets tyranny. In Lincoln's telling, the mobocratic spirit sets itself against government capacity. When the government is no match for the mob, the destructive passions are unleashed. A tyrant will then arise to offer order. This will be, quote, and this is probably the most famous line from Lincoln's speech and one that's been appeared in op-eds in the last month. This will be, quote, some man possessed of the loftiest genius, coupled with ambition sufficient to push it to its utmost stretch, end quote, for whom the difference between doing good and harm is as nothing, so long as the doing brings, in Lincoln's word, distinction. Those who question the propriety of what Musk or others in the Trump administration are doing, whether they are judges, elected officials, or bureaucrats, risk being harassed by online mobs and the government itself. This threat secures obedience, perhaps not less than official sanction. Concern over the mobocratic spirit is not isolated to the political left. In his year-end report on the federal judiciary, Chief Justice Roberts expressed alarm about the threats facing federal judges. He noted that, quote, the volume of hostile threats and communications directed at judges has more than tripled over the past decade. End quote. In the past 5 years alone, federal marshals, quote, report that they've investigated more than 1,000 serious threats against federal judges. And he goes on to blame doxing, social media mis and disinformation, and foreign campaigns, sounding very much like critics on the left. He complains of agents feeding, quote, false information into the marketplace of ideas, end quote. And he goes on to talk about bots distorting judicial decisions, using fake or exaggerated narratives to foment discord, and then concludes that, quote, we must as a nation publicize the risks and take all appropriate measures to stop them for the sake of public confidence in judicial processes and outcomes. So what to do about the mob? Is it already too late? For Lincoln, the answer is upstream of politics. He prescribed that the people must be united with each other, attached to the government and its laws, and generally intelligent to successfully frustrate the tyrant's designs. In other words, in Lincoln's view, the only way to combat tyranny is to make reverence for the law, the civic creed. Sandy Levinson, in his book on constitutional faith, observes how this call was taken up in postbellum America and animated the reborn nation. The creed lives in oaths that federal officers take to the constitutional order. Oaths and reverence probably meant something different in an America when that treated oaths as sacred acts. But still today, we see how many courageous federal officers are asserting the primacy of those oaths. As every autocrat will tell you, rule of law and respect for political institutions are rather malleable phrases. Oh, sorry. Oh, I don't know where this one is. Sorry, I've got to show you this one because I'm sorry, I must have. There, that's the one. Thanks to Avi Soifer. I lost my cueing. Okay, so Avi pointed out to me that rule of law is an anagram for awful lore. And Lincoln's assassin thought that he was the tyrant. After all, he had suspended habeas corpus, which most experts at the time and later did not think was in the president's power. He did lots of other things, including censoring the telegraph, throwing printing presses into the water, essentially. And so, you know, the malleability of rule of law, we also see in the treatment of the Lyceum Address. Lincoln has been a hero to repressive as well as liberatory leaders, opponents of the civil rights movement in the 60s, leaned on the Lyceum speech to push against lawless civil disobedience. And Senator McCarthy quoted the Lyceum address as warning about domestic threats as support for his agenda. We can acknowledge that Lincoln had a complicated relationship with the law, and recognize that in the end, he ushered in a new and better constitution. And so who knows, maybe with the help of obvious students, we have before us constitutional amendments and new births of freedom. Let us pray. This. Okay. Lincoln closed his address with a salute to the founders' revolutionary passion. That passion did its work in the founding era, he says, but it, quote, will in future be our enemy. In place of the mob's passion, Lincoln says, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason will defend the republic. Appetite for the ability to reason would have to be inculcated, parented, educated into the citizenry. Let reverence for law, Lincoln says, be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe. Let it be taught in schools and seminaries and in colleges. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. All this teaching and preaching builds demand for rule of law and attendant democratic deliberation. Good governance, in other words, is downstream of culture. It's notable that Lincoln gives this speech in a local voluntary association designed to foster learning and participation, the sort of place that delighted de Tocqueville. In his Democracy in America, also from the 1830s, he wrote that such associations cultivated the practice of democracy for the American who plunges, quote, into the wilderness of the New World with his Bible, a hatchet, and newspapers. Which brings us to the main part of my talk. Do you notice the Hawaiian theme in the AI-generated art? Few would say that TikTok, X, Blue Sky, YouTube, or Facebook are fostering an empire of reason. These platforms follow on predecessor technologies, each of which has worried critics that it would unfit the population for democratic self-rule. Or to use Lincoln's language, that it would supplant reason with passion. And with each new technology, citizens and their representatives have tried to better align the technology with the requirements of a democratic republic. Notwithstanding these interventions, there really has never been the will or institutional commitment to support the cultural project Lincoln imagined. Far from bathing us in cool reason, our communication systems evolved to promote ever hotter and more inflammatory exchanges of information. It has become easy to activate and assemble mobs, even if only on screens that average, depending on your demographics, 4 to 6 hours of daily attention. Social media pair hot takes with data-driven personalized messaging and addictive design to hack and frack attention. The frayed quality and polarized directions of our attention make it hard to even imagine a shared language around terms like rule of law or political institutions. How did we get here? We might as well start with the year of the Lyceum speech, for it was in 1838 that Samuel Morse brought the telegraph to the US Capitol in hopes of securing congressional funding to develop the new technology. Morse acknowledged that the telegraph, like most technologies, was multivalent. In a letter to the chairman of the House Commerce Committee, he wrote, "This mode of instantaneous communication must inevitably become an instrument of immense power, to be wielded for good or for evil, as it shall be properly or improperly directed." While Unionists initially thought the telegraph would bind the nation together, they soon discovered it exacerbated sectional tensions. Richard John, in his book Network Nation, quotes a Unionist calling the telegraph a treacher, which sends, quote, an electric thrill of panic, end quote, every hour after the transmission of misleading news reports to the home front that had been sent by irresponsible journalists from the theater of war. Western Union allied itself with the Associated Press, both monopolies in their domains, to furnish newspapers with news of the day. Between the two of them, they controlled the news and could also read private messages. sort of like a digital platform can control news feeds and also read DMs. In the razor-thin presidential election of 1876, Western Union backed Hayes. Republican Hayes was apparently losing to Democrat Tilden when the telegraph company provided Hayes with internal messages from Tilden's campaign, helping Hayes to reorient his efforts. Tim Wu, in his book, The Master Switch, holds up this event as an example of how power over communications networks can confer political advantage. We might say it's a synergy of tyranny.com and tyranny.gov. The federal government would eventually regulate the telegraph as a common carrier to mitigate the effects of monopoly. On the newswire end, it wasn't until 1945 in AP versus US that the Supreme Court reined in AP for its monopolistic behavior. Justice Black wrote in that decision, one of the defining aspirations of American free speech jurisprudence. What was necessary for a free society is his quote, was to promote, quote, the widest dissemination of information from diverse and antagonistic sources. Cracking open tyranny.com was a way of preventing tyranny.gov. Diverse and antagonistic voices include nonsense. The telegraph was a principal driver at the end of the 19th century of yellow journalism, named after this little yellow man cartoon. I didn't know that until I started this research. Rival newspaper magnates Joseph Pulitzer and Hearst both used this cartoon, competing with each other in newspapers throughout the country with sensational, false, or unverified stories. Hearst was very much in favor of the US going to war against Spain and the Caribbean. So he transmitted the conspiracies blaming the Spanish for blowing up the SS Maine to inflame the public. Fake news was not new now, and it wasn't new then. What was new was the use of nationwide economic power to propagate lies. Yellow journalism coincided with a period of repeated economic shocks, monopoly growth, government corruption, mob violence in the Jim Crow South, and attacks against immigrants in the fast industrializing North. With all this mess, reformers trained their eyes on media. By the 1920s, the media advertising model was mature, and Edward Bernays published his pioneering work, Propaganda, on how to exploit human irrationality to sell cigarettes and politics. Accelerating social change stoked anxieties about democratic governance. Walter Lippmann despaired of the public's ability to manage their political affairs and favored heavy elite intermediation. Newspapers, he thought, should be subjected to technocratic control to ensure that people received carefully curated information to deal with mis and disinformation. John Dewey took a different view, more aligned with Justice Black's. People could be trusted to overcome their irrationality and low-quality information if only they had more civics and media literacy. This debate between elite direction and bottom-up muddling through, albeit under the tutelage of the virtuous, continued to shape media policy over the next century. By the 1930s, with the spread of radio broadcasting, yellow journalism was more compelling as it streamed into people's living rooms. This time, America firsters were anti-war, and the messaging viciously anti-Semitic and pro-fascist. Father Charles Coughlin reached about 1 in 3 Americans, I think that's about 30 million people, by the end of the decade. When he blamed Kristallnacht on its Jewish victims, some of the radio stations that had carried his sermons took a step back. Major networks like NBC and CBS decided to ban paid political and religious programming altogether for a time, presaging the move of digital platforms in the 2020s to experiment with deplatforming and selective algorithmic promotion. The vibe shift against Coughlin's incitement in the 1930s had much more effect than what we saw in the 2020s, both because of the control broadcasters exercised and because of the regulatory pressure the newly constituted FCC could bring to bear. The vibe turned decidedly after World War II. At least among elites, there was a return to something a little bit like Lincoln's rhetoric. Having escaped the fascist and communist waves that swept Europe, The US, it was argued, needed to set its sights on demand-side democracy. Communications, again, were a central part of this project. Looking back, people understood the important role radio had played in promoting Hitler and his project in Germany. In the US, in addition to the Coughlin scourge, there was a hoax radio broadcast in 1938 that scared the bejesus out of Americans. Orson Welles had broadcast on CBS radio a fake play-by-play of a Martian invasion. It was so realistic and alarming as to sow panic among thousands of listeners. The government noted broadcasting, the US government noted broadcasting's power to make worlds and shape reactions. Seeing this, Henry Luce, CEO of the great Time Life media empire, thought industry should get out ahead of possible regulation. He sponsored a commission of leading intellectuals chaired by University of Chicago President Hutchins to figure out what media should look like in the post-war era. One of my mentors, the legal scholar C. Edwin Baker, Ed Baker, wrote in 2007 that the Hutchins Commission report is, quote, the most important semi-official policy-oriented study of the mass media in US history. It articulated the social responsibility theory of the press, which goes something like this. Self-government requires a press that acts as the fourth estate, independent from government and committed to the service of truth. Very much echoing Lincoln's prescription of cool reason, the Hutchins Commission imagined a press that provided dispassionate information without fear or favor in service of a self-governing citizenry. To fulfill this function, the press itself would have to exercise Republican virtues and self-restraint in its own sphere. Breaking the Watergate story and associated corruptions of the 1970s might have marked peak social responsibility press. These were the years that produced lawyers like our honoree and our sponsor, Reed Hundt. The social responsibility press, like many liberal commitments, posits the possibility of operating outside of politics and passion. It imagines that White House reporters can collaborate in a press pool around basic facts, for example. That there is a distinction between fact and opinion is central not only to this conception of journalism, but also to law and democratic governance. When the White House exerts control over the press pool and shuns unfriendlies, it is attacking that basic distinction. In any case, by the 1970s, Americans' attention was migrating to television entertainment. FCC Chairman Newt Minow famously had warned in 1961 that much of television was a vast wasteland. He was focused on banal content. What the media scholar Marshall McLuhan wrote in 1964, when he wrote that the medium is the message, he was arguing that content just didn't matter that much. More important for culture were the technical affordances of media and the ways in which they related to our rational facilities. Using Lincoln's temperature metaphor, didn't cite Lincoln, but McLuhan divided media into hot and cold. Hot media demanded from us little cognitive work or reason. Cold media asked us to participate in the construction of meaning. Weirdly, McLuhan thought TV was a cold medium. Not so one of his students, Neil Postman. In his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is another anniversary, 40 years old this year, Postman essentially predicts the way that someone like Trump will use a hot medium to take control. Very much in keeping with Lincoln's Lyceum forecast, he writes that America will be conquered from within. Quote, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. What we love will ruin us. With nostalgia for a past era of patient discourse around oratory and print, Postman dates the decay to the telegraph, which created, quote, a neighborhood of strangers and pointless quantity, a world of fragments and discontinuities. Sociologist Daniel Boorstin observed that television encouraged the production of pseudo-events, of meaningless happenings imbued with fake significance. Postman used the term disinformation, not as we use it to mean intentionally false, but maybe something worse, beside the point, distracting, numbing. Ultimately, Postman wrote, TV creates a, quote, culture overwhelmed by irrelevance, incoherence, and impotence. One of his most incisive observations was that TV collapsed context, presenting events immediate and far away, relevant and irrelevant, grave and trivial in a single flickering stream of images that discouraged discerning engagement. These were President Reagan's 1980s, and the spirit was deregulatory. These were Donald Trump's 1980s, and the bywords were go-go and greed. These were the early days of an expansion of TV options with Fox, talk radio, and then cable channels. If there was a policy response to concerns about TV's impact on democracy, it was to foster competition. There continued to be tepid support for the Great Society project of public broadcasting. Ambitious in goals, if not in funding, the creation of a non-commercial broadcast network was responsive to another blue ribbon commission of luminaries, the Carnegie Commission. To this body, author E.B. White had written that TV should, quote, address itself to the ideal of excellence through programs that arouse our dreams, end quote, and a system of local stations capable of becoming, wait for it, our Lyceum, our Chautauqua, and our Camelot. The hope was that hundreds of local stations spread out across the country from small towns and farm communities to big cities would produce programming and also convene people in person, IRL. Reasoned inquiry, if not cold welcome, was a core value. One thing local and national public media always did well was to platform new voices and formats left out of the mainstream. Here we got the first reality TV program, which would serve Donald Trump so well. Big Bird and Kids TV, science and documentary programming, and even some conservatives had their beginnings here. However much public and burgeoning commercial media might have advanced Justice Black's ideal of diverse and antagonistic voices, this was nothing compared to what the early internet birthed. There are few people who know more about the 1996 Telecoms Act than Reed Hundt, who as FCC chairman was responsible for implementing it, but the rest is not his fault. Some combination of DARPA investments in Berners-Lee and the Act made the internet. Law fostered infrastructure development and liability shelters for digital intermediaries. When signing the law, President Clinton made a comment similar to what had been said on Capitol Hill about the telegraph. Quote, "We know the information age will bring blessings for our people and our country. But like most human blessings, we know the blessings will be mixed." End quote. Like the Unionists, Clinton imagined the information superhighway would bring Americans together. Quote, "That same spirit of connection and communication is the driving force behind this law." And with that, he handed the pen to the information superhighways champion, Al Gore, whose father, Senator Al Gore Sr., had sponsored the Interstate Highway Act. The decade or so that followed was filled with tech optimism for what Douglas Rushkoff called open source democracy. This was the Dewey dream, that internet-enabled communication and decentralization would advance democratic self-rule. I never quite shared that optimism. I was more inclined to trust those like Evgeny Morozov, who in 2011, in his book Net Delusion, warned that autocrats and oligarchs would figure out how to capitalize on the technology. As soon as tech companies figured out how to build platforms that would engage people in a mostly passive media experience, the industry consolidated the telegraph's one-to-one communication and the broadcaster's reach. Add to that network effects and algorithms that enclosed people in particular corporate architectures, and the decentralized web of the early aughts was gone. The Supreme Court last term in Moody versus NetChoice continued to refer to social media platforms as, quote, the modern public square, gesturing toward this Dewey ideal. And it is that, but it sunders apart as much as it convenes. If TV proved to be a fiery medium, social media communications are an inferno. The social science around what exactly social media has done to our discourse and reasoning continues to evolve. Recent studies seem to confirm McLuhan's insight that the tech affordances are most important. These include the tenor, speed, and amplification of content, as well as the mobilization of radicals and incentives for bad behavior. These features hack our attention in ways that undermine cool reason and abet mobocracy. I'm not suggesting that communications and culture alone explain our current moment, but it's hard not to see that Trump, Musk, and those around him have turned internet trolling culture into a governance agenda. It is a trollocracy. I'll focus on 3 media design features: incentives, amplification, and mobs. It once took significant investments from Orson Welles and CBS Radio to fool the nation into believing it was under attack. Digital media makes it trivially easy to concoct and spread lies that seem realistic, especially, and this is what the research shows, especially among those inclined to believe them anyway. Viral content is more likely to be low quality, unverified, or flat out false. Postman noted context collapse in TV. It's so much worse online, with bits of audio or video flying around untethered to any context. Editorial standards, fact-checking, and distinctions between news and opinion are simply not rewarded or even understood. Borston's pseudo-events now constitute much of our politics, with electeds and constituents alike performing for likes and shares. As with previous technologies, the affordances of social media are multivalent. One of the delights is meme culture. These visual jokes can wonderfully make light of and diffuse difficult subjects. They can also swiftly convert subversive chuckles into radical positions. The new right has perfected the use of memes, just joking, in it for the lulz, to valorize political violence. Nazi salutes, violence against women, minorities, and other outgroups. Is it just a joke? Just edgelord trolling? The media scholar Joan Donovan's work in her book Meme Wars documents how memes and viral rage led the militia curious to pitchforks on January 6th. Trump is a master of meme culture. When he posts from the official White House site a picture of King Trump wearing a crown, he's just joking, or not. Not for nothing, Musk named Doge after layers of memes. A meme coin named for an older meme of a Shiba Inu dog with broken English. Reverence for the rule of law requires, first of all, a sense of reverence. There are no sacred cows in meme culture. It is revolutionary or reactionary, but never reverent. Algorithmic amplification further intensifies angry communication. Leveraging personal data, platform recommender systems, and feeds direct hot rhetoric to willing consumers. With this architecture, it's no wonder that the work of government becomes bite-sized rage performances. The Hutchins and Carnegie Commissions believed that communications companies should support self-governance. That might mean fair and serious news coverage or helping local communities to cohere. In the digital world, the entities with that power are the platform designers, and they don't feel that responsibility. Whatever they did in the past few months, they seem to have been completely liberated from any vestige of responsibility that they once assumed. Rule of law ultimately relies on widespread acceptance of the legitimacy of law. It relies on people accepting a sphere of neutrality in which equal application of the law is possible. Our digital platforms, by virtue of the power of influencers and algorithms, flood us with repeated assertions that things are not on the level. With context collapsed, you will easily see that the other side, or those people, are crooked. What you've been told is not true. If you believed in neutral principle, you were a sucker. These narratives spin out on both left and right, but mostly on the right, in the form of populist attacks on institutional authority and expertise, rejection of fair journalism, and illiberal ideologies. The result is an environment in which reason compromise gives way to zero-sum power struggle. Finally, the last feature of social media brings us back most clearly to Lincoln's fears. We love to feel that we're part of a tribe, that we're empowered to take action, the ability to rouse the following to a cause, or to join that cause is one of the wonderful affordances of social media. It's what fueled the Iranian Twitter revolution in 2010 and the Ukrainian Maidan revolution in 2014. Distinguishing a protest from a mob shouldn't depend on whose side you're on. As Lincoln used the word, mobs usurped the state's legitimate monopoly on force. Online mobs rarely go this far, but they sometimes do. Just ask the Sandy Hook families. And they frequently threaten to. At the very least, for most people, being harassed, doxxed, and lied about will quickly silence their diverse and antagonistic voices. In his first administration, Trump brought the online pile into the White House, calling out particular people for MAGA harassment. Those practices are now much more widespread. Lawmakers fear that mobs will be directed to their houses, as Justice Roberts was afraid for his colleagues. We can only wonder whether online mob culture has softened the ground for mob actions in the government. Uncredentialed DOJ functionaries exercising illegitimate authority is arbitrary power, cousin to the mob. Let me take you back to the Lyceum, to the Lyceum address as we close. One of the rhetorical moves Lincoln makes in his address is to tell the stories of mob violence twice, once in a way that make the victims of mob violence sympathetic and once less so. For example, in the second telling, he says the Mississippi gamblers who were hanged were, quote, worse than useless in any community. They were like plague or smallpox. By doing this, he's challenging the audience to distinguish policy from process. Even if you agree with the policy outcomes of the mob, you surely can't condone the lawless process. And this is what the ABA was saying in its letter. Patience is required for rule of law. The mob that lynched McIntosh could not wait for justice. And this is why the Trump administration does not use its compliant Congress to pass laws. It uses the tools and temperament of the mob and the troll. Where rule of law requires patience, our communications privilege immediacy. Where ordered liberty makes distinctions between proof and conjecture, political and legal, gangster and government, our communications collapse categories and context. This collapse then manifests in Washington, D.C. Dorothy Thompson wrote in 1938, just after Wells's War of the Worlds broadcast, quote, the greatest organizers of mass hysterias and delusions today are states using the radio to excite terrors, incite hatreds, inflame masses, abolish reason, and maintain themselves in power. What Wells had done, and she was addressing that, defending that, was just performance art. The real threat is the fascist use of media. When government itself is the performer capitalizing on mass hysteria and delusions, a democratic culture must resist. I wish I had a list of 10 correctives for our media culture, something like Tim Snyder's list in reverse. There are a lot of good design ideas out there about how to build better social media, how to reduce the control of algorithms and the logic of big tech, how to cultivate better information sharing, hygiene, and literacy, how to support local journalism and other aspects of the press. How to deal with the next tsunami of AI-generated synthetic content. Some of these involve law and policy, but I have to say these suggestions hardly seem relevant at the moment. There are also good ideas that are much older than that about building democratic culture in real places like the Lyceum. In the early 19th century, there were 3,000 lyceums scattered in towns across a much smaller United States. There's a movement now to bring them back. Touch grass. Whatever the distribution method, we should take seriously the demand side of rule of law and reasoned discourse. As Lincoln knew, storytelling is at the heart of the matter. Lincoln's lessons that the mob metastasizes, it comes for you, and it embeds tyranny, all have to be brought home in actual stories. These are stories about the corrupt prosecution, the shuttered federal service, the crooked contract, diffused through every medium and using all affordances. And that used to be the job of journalists, and it still is, but it's the job now for all of us. Thank you. think we have time for questions, comments?
Pretty scary.
So the lecture was both kind of depressing and scary. We've been on this, but Trump is a clown in search of a circus. He found it with the Republican Party. And the Republican Party has been on this arc since Nixon in 1973. When he said, a president doesn't break the law, he can do what he wants. And it was carried on by Reagan, it was carried on by the Bush and Cheney group. It got us into a war that we didn't get into. And now we're here at Trump. So I think Trump is more of kind of the canary in the coal mine of this problem. But I mean, is there any kind of thing we can do to, you know, break up this Republican influence that we've got? Or it's just been, they've been on this path and they've had a plan for 50 years. And this is the result of that plan. They've got the Supreme Court, they got the Congress, they got the president. That wasn't by accident. So what is the plan to counteract all this?
I wish I knew, but I mean, I think, you know, I sort of date it, I think about Gingrich and sort of this constant refrain of when will the fever break, right? Like, when is this gonna stop? And, you know, I think we have to conclude that it won't break until there is, you know, sort of serious pain and more, you know, actual breakage. And, you know, it does, when I was doing this research and looking at the Lincoln stuff, he also kind of wanted to muddle along, right? He wanted to, in 1838, he wanted to muddle along and sort of try to manage all the tensions. And we saw where that ended up. And God willing, we won't have a violent civil war. But my own personal view, and it's not my area of expertise, it's just my personal view, is that that's kind of where we're headed, to kind of total breakage and reconstruction. I don't know what that looks like, but that's my, I don't know. Does anyone else have a view?
How relevant do you think speed is to all this? Most of the technologies have speeded everything up. And certainly the internet today, people don't stop to think before responding, etc. And so my question is, how relevant is speed as a common denominator? And have you heard of any technological or other methods that might have been, are being proposed to slow down? You know, Jimmy Durant, stop the music.
Yeah, I mean, so I really appreciate the question, and I have this slide because I do sort of research and come up with policy proposals about how do you inject friction into the system. And it can be in the form of, I mean, you've seen it sort of, do you want to retweet this? Have you read the article? You know, limiting the amount of the speed and scope of circulation, distribution of messages. WhatsApp has done this. You can, you know, limits how many people can read. So there are a lot of good ideas about injecting friction. The reason why I didn't include that in my talk is because, you know, these policy proposals right now have no home and no possibility of moving forward. And so, yes, I think if we were in normal times, like a year ago, I could have devoted this whole lecture to exactly that idea. You know, I think the problem is people don't like friction, right? They don't want to be stopped. And so there's a demand side problem with that, but that's just, when I said there are really good ideas for new kinds of social media, a lot of them do have to do with kind of speed bumps and circuit breakers.
Yes, I'd like to I work with in an organization where we have currently people from 32 countries talking about exactly these issues this past week. And so it's not a US problem alone. It's kind of a broad scope concern about empowering authoritarians by the media to move forward into some ways we've seen already being manifested in the United States. The discussions we're having, the general topic of discussions is we're still admiring the problem, right? Which is fine because we need to understand the problem before we can address it. But the question is, what's the next step? Is there an educational component Is it a regulatory one, like breaking up like AMT sort of dimension? Look at the McCarthy era where you had actually a respected spokesperson stand up and be counted around which other people get. Edward Murrow comes to. So my question to you is, you're looking at that short list, where do you see the greatest hope for moving forward for those who would push back in a constructive way?
I mean, I think you've identified education. I mean, I think the respected spokespeople now are the influencers. And so I think, you know, it's many influencers who have audiences and following and are engaged in meme culture. I mean, if we're talking about sort of Gen Z, who has, you know, tilted quite heavily for Trump. So if we're trying to, and I don't think understand any of the consequences. If one is trying to reach them, it has to be using the affordances of social media in a concerted way. I also think there is we haven't really mentioned AI, and I think everyone's probably initial reaction is, oh my gosh, that's just going to make all this so much worse. But there are ways in which I think it could make things better. And so, you know, if you imagine that you had a kind of AI agent who was working for you, and it was then the question, again, it's on the demand side, can you educate people to want, or make it cool to want, or have influencers get people to want an agent that is actually filtering communications for them in a way that is pro-social and pro-democratic, however that would be defined. But I think, you know, I mean, and of course, there are political movements and organizing, and that's obviously, you know, that is probably the solution. The gentleman behind you, I mean, that's ultimately what has to happen. But on the media piece, I think you sort of identified the things that have to be pushed on. And I think, you know, the people who work in policy, we've been looking at policy solutions for the past decade. And all of those have now run aground, right? So to the extent that people were thinking about antitrust or regulatory requirements or you know, interoperability kind of technical solutions that freed you from these algorithms. All of those proposals as policy proposals, lots of them are good, but they're all dead in the water, at least on the federal level. So I think those are just your kind of sort of bottom up, external to policy solutions are the things we have to try.
Perhaps the last question?
Yeah.
On the one hand, you paint a picture of an increasingly dire situation. On the other hand, this wonderful historical overview demonstrates there's an enduring tension in America between educated elites like us, who just wish most people had better values, and regular people. So, I mean, maybe one of the takeaways that could be viewed as positive or maybe level setting for us in the broad value is that this is a recurrent and regular tension in American culture and probably won't ever get fixed or go away, but just transform through time.
Absolutely. And I think, and as I was writing this, you know, there was this voice in my head, which is like, you know, those kids and their new technology, and it's been a recurring complaint on the one hand, and the Republic has survived and adjusted on the one hand. On the other hand, I think the sort of hotness metaphor, it has kept getting hotter and hotter and hotter. So, you know, at some point, I think, and maybe we've reached the sort of boiling point where we have to reconsider our relationship to these communications technologies, or we just adjust. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a brilliant lecture. Thank you so much for a very high bar set, unlikely to be surpassed. So I don't want to step on the toes of the party. I'm told that it's going to be a wonderful party. And one of the reasons we're all gathered here, I think, is how important community is and what a group. So let's look out for one another, and thank Ellen so much for this. And thank all of you for coming, and thank you for our sponsors. So law has relied on legal fictions for a long time, but now we got to rely on legal frictions.
Yeah, I agree.